Okay, and my sound's okay, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Welcome back to New Realities. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and this program for me is about discovering people with original ideas, new thoughts, how we can integrate these new ideas into our society. And Paul Levy, you're a genius in the sense because you've written these books on Wetiko. Undreaming Wetiko is your latest one, and I think we have to. I almost get what Wetiko is, but it's like trying to hold water. It's so. I mean, you've defined it before, and it is this presence, this force that stops us from being our true selves in a sense. But it also, I think you say, helps us find that self. So,
Right.
how would you define it so people could maybe recognize how it appears in their lives? That's one way of looking at it. How would you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
No, thank you. No, it's a factor in our psyche, in our unconscious. All of us have, we all have that resistance to when we want to be creative, or we've internalized in our lives when we've expressed ourselves or let our light shine, we get oppressed or shut down, and that becomes introjected. So it's some sort of like adversarial force. And even the greatest, of the practitioners in Tibet and Burma, they're always talking about, yeah, there's something in our psyche that numbs us, that like puts us asleep, and what we have to shed light on that in order to awaken. Because if you want to protect your nature, you have to know what threatens it. And so one way of understanding Wetiko, that, and I'm just a translator, this isn't something I've discovered. I mean, I had my own personal experience with it in my own life that completely changed the whole trajectory of my life. But the way it's conceived of is like a mind virus. And when people hear of a mind virus, like with COVID, I was pointing out, COVID is just the most superficial reflection in the physical dimension of what's actually happening within our psyches. And when people hear about a mind virus, some mainstream people might think, oh, that's kind of woo-woo or out there or crazy or new agey. But all that it's really saying is that the source of the collective madness, because Wetiko is a collective psychosis, the source of it is to be found within the psyche. And that's a no-brainer. Like, where else in the world could the source of our collective madness be found? And I'm pointing out so I'm just a translator, putting it into a modern psychological idiom for modern people. And I point out that Wetiko, it's a quantum phenomenon. What I mean by that specifically is just like, what is the nature of light? Well, it's a wave or a particle depending on how it's observed. And there's a superposition of states. And just like that, Wetiko is the source of the greatest evil that we play out both in our lives, personally, within our own minds, and collectively as a species. But it's also hidden and coded within the pathogen is its own vaccine, is its own medicine. And not only that, it actually is helping us. It's catalyzing our awakening as a species. It's helping us to evolve. And and I could say a ton more about it. This is just the most thumbnail sketch of it. But one of the major points, so it works through the projective tendencies of the mind, because we're always projecting onto the waking ink blot in such a way that we entrance ourselves. It is exactly like we're in a fairy tale and our species has fallen under a spell. And the thing about Wetiko, it's this living revelation. It's actually revealing exactly what we need to know in order to expand our consciousness and wake up. But, and here's the rub, if we don't recognize the revelation, what it's revealing to us, it will continue to kill us. And so that's just a little bit.
Plus, we just think daily life is, there's resistance here and there's people cutting you off in traffic there. And can you hear me okay? Is my mic okay?
Yeah. Now it's a little bit better that it's closer,
okay.
I think.
No, is that I can make it even better. Is that
Yeah,
better?
that's good. Yeah,
okay. I guess maybe if you don't mind talking about your life a little bit, because you've told your story before where what I get was your father was not a nice person. He didn't treat you well. It pushed you deep into despair and sorrow and sadness. And yet you discovered this thing that it may not even have been him. It's the Wetiko that was working through your father that was activating your negative sense of yourself. And it also gave you the gift of Wetiko that you now awakened so many people. So you can maybe blame your father. I don't know if you do, or you can say your father gave you this incredible gift of knowledge to understand the human dilemma. Is that a fair way?
Yeah. And, I mean, I'm not, my whole work in Wetiko, I'm not coming from a point of view of a scholar or an academic, even though I'm sort of a nerd. I love to study stuff, but that's not at all where I'm coming from. I had a direct, close encounter of the Wetiko kind, first with my father, who, yeah, and one way of understanding him, he just, instead of, we all have unhealed trauma, instead of him responsibly trying to deal with it in his own self, he just, like a lot of people do, they just become taken over by their trauma and they unconsciously, compulsively act it out on the next of kin. And I was the only child. And it could have killed me. I mean, it so destabilized me. And, I mean, there's a whole book I wrote about it. I don't need to go into the story. Yeah. The point is that I began to recognize that my father had become taken over by some sort of higher dimensional force, and even that, I mean, you could say archetypal transpersonal force, something that was more powerful than the ego. And he had literally, completely unconsciously, become a conduit for this, sort of not a human force, but an impersonal, transpersonal force to come through him, and it was just channeling this incredible darkness. And because he had been taken over, because Wetiko, to the extent we don't see it, being this archetypal energy, it can literally possess a person. It can take them over. And typically they're oblivious to that because it operates through the unconscious blind spot, because Wetiko is a form of blindness. But it's a form of blindness that actually believes it's sighted. And so then when my father got taken over by that, on one level, at first, I was really young. I was in my early 20s. And, I kind of saw it as a personal thing. But then I began to realize, no, wait a second. My father just got conjured up to play this role in a higher dimensional, transcendental process. That's when all of a sudden my consciousness began to expand. And I began to realize, wait, that same darker force that played out through the person of my father played out in the system of psychiatry. Because once I awakened, because I dealt so deeply with the wound, that I actually had a profound awakening. And I was so excited at what I was realizing that within hours, I immediately got locked up and pathologized and told I have a mental illness that I'll have the rest of my life and I'll need to be on medication. And I just thought, I knew it was super clear to me that I was having an awakening. But I began to realize the same darker force that came through the person of my father was coming through this system of psychiatry. And then I began to recognize, like iterations of a fractal, that's that same evil force that's playing out through the body politic of our species on the world stage. And that's when I began to realize, oh my God, this is a revelation. And this happened 40 plus years ago with my father, and I'm still unpacking the revelatory aspects of it. But if I didn't recognize that, the revelation part of it, it would have taken me down. It would have killed me. It would have driven me crazy, definitely.
Well, would you say Wetiko is these forces that are creating war? Is my sound a little better now?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you say like there's this war going on in the Middle East and it's really over maybe whose God is better than it's a reflection of each other, these sides, I guess, in any war. And, not to say there's not awful things that happen, there are. But it seemed like it's a function of the very same thing that you're talking about.
Totally. And to even be more specific, before I learned the word Wetiko, which is an indigenous term, I had written a book about, did not have a name for Wetiko, but I called it malignant egophrenia, ME disease, me disease, which is a misidentification of who we think we are. And then just playfully, very creatively, I began to go, well, ME disease. Okay, that's one name for it. It can also stand for like sort of like mad emperor disease, ME disease, somebody who's in a position of power, absolute power, they abuse it like a mad emperor. But then I realized it can also stand for Middle East disease because it's Wetiko is a systemic disease that has infected all of us. It's in the collective unconscious. And there's an acute inflammation and outbreak in the Middle East. And when you recognize what's playing out in the Middle East and the incredible shadow projection both ways, because the whole like psychological dynamic that underlies Wetiko is to be found within the psyche. And so yeah, the thing you meant, it's funny you mentioned about the Middle East, because there's a way of seeing what's happening in the Middle East where it can help you to see Wetiko, because it really is like an acute outbreak and inflammation of this more wide, pervasive systemic disease that infects all of us in potential.
But there's no resolution out there. It's like, they are going at it because what would be a way out? And how do you recognize if you're in this taken over that you're in the dream? I mean, how do you discover?
Yeah. Well, you're asking a question about like the Middle East with, the Palestinians and the Israelis, whatever. But understand it's all iterations of a fractal, because that totally, can, be an expression of what's happening individually. Say if somebody's enacting their trauma unconsciously, compulsively, or they're enacting their addiction, their habitual patterns, they're going to be fated to do that. So the way we try to, heal from our trauma actually creates the trauma we're trying to heal from, and an infinitely self-reinforcing feedback loop. And, in which we're actually self-destructing, by our compulsive actions. It's like we're taken over by something. And the thing is that, and in the collective works, Jung himself makes this really clear, that this isn't something that we can have, that, let's enact a new law or whatever no, this had the individual is the carrier of what happens. So just in an individual person's process, when that person, through the act of acting out their trauma, their addiction, encoded in their acting it out, they're trying to experience something, right? Because a beautiful definition of trauma is unexperienced experience. At the moment of trauma, by definition, it's an overwhelming moment. We split off, we dissociate, but we never were able to consciously experience or creatively symbolize what we experienced. So then that informs the repetition compulsion, which is the pathology of trauma. But the point is, in that repetition compulsion, which is the symptom, is encoded, we're trying to consciously experience what we weren't able to experience. And so it's not just an intellectual understanding, I'm talking just as an individual. We actually have to, in a sense, have that realization of, oh my God, here I'm compelled to act out against my best interests, and yet encoded in that acting out is the very medicine. Now, then imagine that expanded to like the Middle East, but the thing I'm saying is that it has to start with the individual, that each one of us, to the extent we're able to do that in our lives, that immediately gets sort of deposited in the collective unconscious. And hopefully when a sufficient number of us, you can say it a number of ways: awaken to who we are, own our shadow, see Wetiko, to realize the dreamlike nature, all different ways of saying the same thing. When a sufficient number of us have that realization, I mean, we then embody it. And then we actually, just like Wetiko is contagious through the unconscious, when enough of us actually embody, or even one of us, the realization of the nature that, that we're having a dream, because my whole work is based on, this experience I had 40 plus years ago when I realized, oh my God, this is a dream. And just like in a night dream, you can have lucidity and wake up, and that changes everything if you stabilize that lucidity. When enough of us have that realization and connect with each other, that can go viral, and that's contagious. And that's where the real hope lies.
That's a really good point, for the collective to wake up from the dream. You talk about it playing out in relationships, and that's the most intense playground because you're so intimate. I just had that myself where I saw it in the other person. Maybe I didn't maybe see it in myself, but there was a demand that I meet in a way her old traumas. And it was it was triggering my old traumas. And so
Right.
it just was, there was no way. I mean, what we suggest, how do you step out of the
Right.
trauma and say, wait, our traumas are, how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, in my new book, there's a big chapter on how being in relationship with each other, particularly intimate relationships, that's the playground for Wetiko. That's where our deepest stuff and traumas and wounds and unhealed abuse stuff gets activated and play out. And what comes up for me is that, to create an alchemical container in that relationship. Like, for example, that's part of my work. For 30 years, I've had all of these groups. I now have 4 weekly groups, 2 international and 2 in Portland where I live. And the idea is, yeah, people can tell their story and tell us about their process. And that's all fine and dandy, but that only takes you so far. But then when all of a sudden they start enacting their trauma in the room, with all of us, and we get cast in the role of, being the abuser or being this, then all of a sudden we can get our hands into it and unlock it. But the image of having an alchemical container, because that's the key thing in the art of alchemy, is to have the container, so that stuff that would normally just get acted out unconsciously and re-traumatizing each person and creating more separation and more misunderstanding. And then Wetiko can be conceived of as this seeming entity that's getting fed by all the misunderstanding and separation. But if having a container might be like, oh, wow, what I'm accusing you of, you see, one of the chief features of Wetiko is that typically what we accuse the other person of doing is that what we're unconsciously doing. And it works through the projective tendencies of the mind. So I'll typically see my unconscious shadow. I'll see it projected out onto you. And if I'm asleep, I'll feel like, oh no, that you really are that. And then I feel righteous and innocent and all, and I'm identified with the light. Then the evil is out there. And then, of course, when you amplify that, that creates wars, whether it's between people or nations, because and this is important. You see, the thing about Wetiko, it's such an amazing idea because it's an inner disease of the soul that actually expresses itself through the medium of the outside world. Right. And so synchronistically, what's playing out in the world, whether it's in the Middle East or wherever, is reflecting what's going on in the psyche. But what I just described, when we project the shadow onto someone, and we then, in a way, when you amplify that, like I'm saying, that creates wars, that is an external reflection of the very initial impulse to extinguish our own darkness by projecting it outside of ourselves. So the idea is, when you see the correlation between the outer and the inner, and that what we're enacting unconsciously in the outer world is reflecting our very inner process that we're unconscious of, that's when all of a sudden you begin to recognize the dream-like nature. Because what is a dream? When you're in a dream, what's playing out in the seemingly outer dreamscape is nothing other than this projection, a reflection of what's going on inside the psyche of the dreamer.
Yeah, I think your dream, I don't know what you call your circles that you gather, but it's so brilliant. I mean, the way I understand it, I knew someone who was in your circle, but you create a container of people gathering, and
Right.
I think you say whatever comes up here is going to be a reflection of our unconscious, and then I don't know, people talk, and then some people might get upset about something someone said, and there it is. It's showing its face, and
Right.
this right feels self-righteous. No, I have a right to be. Someone, a victim, and all that. And how do you start to get deeper so there's the
Sure.
reflection?
Well, a couple of things come up. Well, one is, in alchemy, there's the hermetic vessel, and in the vessel is the prima materia. That's like the raw chaos, the shit, the rejected, despised part of our psyche. That's the stuff out of which you make the gold, the philosopher's stone, the holy grail, which is the awakened mind. But underneath the vessel has to be sealed. Underneath the vessel is fire. And so it heats the substance, the prima materia, and it creates this pressure in the vessel. That's why the vessel has to be sealed. But if there's too much pressure, it'll pop its lid. And then all the projections go outside of us. And then we have to start again. But if there's not enough pressure, then the prima materia, it won't transform. And so the idea is that, create enough pressure, make sure it's not too much. But then, if somebody is unconsciously identified, with their stuff and they're just like acting out, that's fine. We all have to do that, as a sort of a stage of integrating our stuff. The problem is if we stay stuck in that unconscious identification, then, that's not workable. But the idea is, say if you and I have this process and I get taken over by my unconscious and I'm like acting it out, and then that's triggering you, right? And then, but say if all of a sudden I'm able to step out of that role and I'm able to sort of, instead of experiencing it subjectively from inside myself, I'm able to experience it objectively, where I contemplate it as if it's, something outside of myself. What I'm describing, this is the shamanic journey. Because what does a shaman do? They take on the illness, they embody it, they fall ill themselves, they experience it as an inside job from within themselves. But if the shaman stays stuck in that, then they need a healer, then they're sick. But the idea is the shaman goes through that, and then at a certain point, they step out of that identity and they contemplate what they just played out, and they get whatever insight. And when they metabolize and integrate that, they jump in and do it again and act out the next level. That's why I'm saying that's the shamanic journey. And that's why I'm also saying in my book, I think the biggest chapter in the new book is about shamanism. I'm saying we're all shamans in training. That's the major archetype that's being activated in the collective unconscious. And the shaman is really just the creative artist, the storyteller. They're the wounded healer. And that's all of us in potential. But what I'm pointing out, and this is from my own experience, for years, I was so wounded and traumatized by what played out with my father in psychiatry that I was just, I need to get rid of this wound. But then over decades, I realized, what if it never goes away? And then I began to realize it's a portal to my creative gifts. There's a way of carrying that woundedness where you're able to access your creativity. And that's what saved me. If I wasn't able to connect, with that creative spirit within me, I would have been in deep trouble. And I realized this isn't just me. This is the deeper archetype. That's why the medicine for the Wetiko mind virus is to connect with our creative spirit.
Right. And you go into that in that book. But can you just describe how your groups work a little bit? I mean, because I've never really been, I've only heard about it. So talk about that and how things appear.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm glad because I think I know who you met. She had told me that met you. Yeah. And she's an amazing she's a filmmaker, amazing person.
Tell her to say hi if I haven't seen her.
Yeah. No, I will. And so the name of the group is Awakening in the Dream Groups. And it's basically people who are awakening to the dreamlike nature, to whatever the extent we are. And the idea is all the wisdom traditions are saying this is a dream, right? I mean, just every single one. I think of the Buddha, who literally said this is a dream. And he wasn't talking metaphorically, he was talking in a literal sense. And what if you bring people together who are tapping in to whatever degree to the dreamlike nature, and we fully take that seriously? We fully step into, okay, this is a dream. And say if there's 10 of us or however many, well, if we're all really putting on the lens of seeing everything that's happening as a dream during the couple of hours we're together on that night in the group, well, that means that you're a dream character of mine and I'm a dream character of yours. I'm an embodied reflective aspect of a part of you and vice versa. And say if something's playing out in the group, that means that we all are co-dreaming whatever's playing out to manifest in that way.
What would be playing out? Give me an example of something that comes up in a group.
Yeah. Well, say somebody is, sharing their process, and they're sharing it in a way where somebody else is being triggered, right? And now the typical response of when a person gets triggered is to see the person who's acting out, that's making them triggered. They see that person as the problem. But from the dreaming point of view, if you're sharing and I'm triggered, oh, instead of me seeing the problem as you, if only you wouldn't share that, Alan, in that way, I would be not triggered. No, that's like the ordinary way of people. But in the group, one of the trainings is, oh, if you're, sharing and I'm triggered, what if I reflect on what inside of me is being touched in that moment instead of putting my attention outside of you? And that becomes sort of, this MO, this way that we're all training each other, and then, for example, say if somebody gives me reflection, because I'm in the role of facilitator, I get paid for it, it's in my house, I've written the books about it. And, so if somebody is giving me reflection, because one of the things that's different, I'm not playing the role like, oh, I'm the teacher or the therapist, and I'm like, hidden behind my authority. No, I'll get triggered, I'll share my struggles. And then when people reflect to me, like if I'm triggered, I can't facilitate. One of the people in the groups one day said to me, Paul, when you get triggered, your IQ goes down 30 points. And I couldn't argue with that. But when I'm triggered, I can't facilitate, because facilitating the facilitator, that's just a role in the field. So all of a sudden, say I'm triggered, I'm acting out my unconscious.
What can you just talk about what triggers people? Like what would trigger you or someone? Like when you say trigger, can you be a little specific?
Like say, for example, here's an example. Say if somebody is sharing their process and they're sharing it in a way where where they're kind of, there's an because the unconscious is imbuing and infusing every moment.
The process would be like, oh, I just had this argument with my girlfriend and she's.
Yeah, exactly. They're sharing that. And then say I get triggered for the way they're sharing it or what it's touching me, right? But in the meanwhile, they're like sharing, they're like embodying something unconscious, and I get triggered, right? And then one of my personal processes is that then typically people point out, Paul, you seem really triggered. Like say I'm reflecting to the person, and all of a sudden, all the attention gets on me. Yeah, Paul, you're triggered. What's that about? And the other person who started the whole process, who the unconscious was coming through, they get off scot-free. And now all of a sudden, all the attention is on me. And so it's pointing at how this Wetiko energy, it's such a trickster and it's elusive, and it will really work through our own self-deception,
What do you do when you'll say, Paul, you're triggered, you're reacting to what this what do you do? How do you work?
What I try to do is model what I want other people to do to the extent I'm able to do that. And that is, if, in a dream, if people are giving me reflections of, wow, Paul, you seem triggered, it feels like, you're acting out your father stuff or whatever it is, right? I'd be a fool to not at least consider what they're saying. And if I just said, no, right away, without even a nanosecond, no, that's not true. Well, then I'm not even self-reflecting at all. So what I'm saying is I try to model in the groups when I get reflection, and I get a ton of reflection because people are in the groups for 25 years. Some of the groups, the average tenure might be 15 years average, each person in the group. It's a weekly group. So you really get to know each other. You get to know each other's buttons and triggers. You start dreaming about each other. And, so like I'm saying, I try to really model what I want people to do, which is when I get reflection to really consider it. And that really helps people, because then they see, oh yeah, we can trust this person. He's not just going to be playing the authority card. It's a circle in the sense that there's not a hierarchy, and that, yeah, I'm the one who's the facilitator, but that role of facilitator is just a role. And when I get in my unconscious, other people pick up the role and help me to go deeper into my stuff. And it's all based on not on the separate self, but when we step out of the separate self, because the separate self is Wetiko. That's a way of understanding Wetiko. And when you see through that imagination, then you realize we're all interdependent and we can hang out in a way that we can help each other to awaken.
Well, like for me, like a couple of weeks ago, 3 times in 1 week, different people didn't know each other said, you really you were acting unconsciously there. You did that, and you affected her and you weren't. So I got these 3 reflections, and I could say, no, it must be, or I could say, well, maybe they are saying something I need to look at. Exactly. And I could be more conscious in these sorts of interactions. And it's like, it's hard for the ego to say that because the ego wants to be right, but it's not just your groups that are it's the world that's, like you said before, it's synchronistically reflecting our deep unconscious.
Right, and
So,
that's why I'll say that the world is like this oracle,
mm,
and when you have the realization that the world is continually reflecting back symbolically, and symbols, by the way, are the language of dreams. So, and that's why so many great teachers talk about the importance of cultivating symbolic awareness, of seeing the dreamlike nature. That like opens up everything, and that unlocks our creativity. And it's to your credit, you got 3 different dream characters, independent, giving you a reflection. How many do you need before you actually begin to realize, oh, the
I
one thing
know.
that in me, maybe they're all seeing something.
Right, but that's Wetiko in its activated form, the reflection coming at me. My ego doesn't want to hear it because the ego thinks it's always right, but yet the thing is coming at me, and I could argue with that, which would be the Wetiko, or accept that as truth, which is kind of calling Wetiko on its game. Is that what you
Yeah, but
mean?
by saying it's true, that means you have to self-reflect and actually see if there's truth to that, and but that's an example of an alchemical container if you're able to do that with each or all of those 3 people. And the idea is to, at least from my conception, the idea of a spiritual community and creating the alchemical vessel is that it's all about that. It's all about, we're just like these reflectors. And if I'm giving you a reflection, I could be totally tripping and totally projecting my own unconscious, and it might not have anything to do with you. Or I could be picking up your unconscious and seeing something, and then it would really behoove you to reflect. Here's the thing I've noticed over the years. You see, when we say, if I or you or whoever in the group reflects to somebody their unconscious blind spot, right, and we're really seeing them act out their unconscious, they will typically feel unseen, and that's really interesting. So when we're actually seeing what they're unconsciously doing, they'll feel unseen. And another thing I've noticed, when somebody is playing out, here's Wetiko coming through them in a particular way, like we all, think about it. Who among us has not fallen into their unconscious and acted it out? We all do, right? That's what I mean, that it's a potential in the collective unconscious. Like if I think, oh, you have Wetiko and I don't, that perspective shows I'm under the thrall of Wetiko. But say if somebody's acting out Wetiko, right? And I'm tracking it, or other people in the group are tracking it, right? They might be unconscious that they're being tracked, but the Wetiko in them, it knows it's being tracked, and it will take them out of the group. I've seen this again and again. Right as people are more and more tracking and seeing the Wetiko in the person, it's like the Wetiko will be like, oh, there's a perfect art class that I've been waiting for on this particular night at this time. Sorry, I have to go and take that class. And then it's like the Wetiko takes them out of the scenario that, they were going to get seen, or it was going to get seen.
Right. But so what is, the essence of Wetiko? Some people say, and I don't think you agree, but it's a foreign force. Some people call it the archons or the predators, or that it's, and you don't go along with that, do you?
Well, I think it's really important to make a distinction.
Yeah.
We, on the absolute level of reality, there's no other, it's all, just one, it's all us, not the ego,
Right.
not the separate self us, but there is no separation, right? But like we subjectively experience these energies, whether you call them the archons, the predators, Wetiko, whatever, it's all equivalent terms. We subjectively experience them as if they're a separate entity, right? As if they're alien to us or other than us. And that's important. That's the nature of our subjective experience, and that needs to be honored. But that's from the relative level. But the absolute level, there is no Wetiko. There is no, and that's, so if people are hearing this and they're like, oh, wow, there's a mind virus and it's something else to be afraid of. No, no, no. Wetiko feeds off of fear. There is nothing to be afraid of. The thing about Wetiko, it doesn't even exist. There's no such thing as Wetiko, and yet it can take down our species. That's the paradox. But what the implication is that to the extent we're unconscious of our nature, of our true nature, then Wetiko manifests as if it's seemingly real. And I just want to point out, what is our true nature? Because it's such a cliche, right? Well, in my work, I point out, well, our true nature by its very nature is creative, right?
Yeah.
We are made in the image of our creator. We are creative beings. We are creating our experience moment by moment. But so here's the thing: when we have the realization of our nature, of our true nature, now I remember who I am. Yeah, what does that mean? That means we embody and express ourselves creatively, because our
Mm.
nature is creative. And then the more we do that, the more that we deepen our realization of our nature in a positive feedback loop that creates light upon light.
Right. William Blake said the imagination is the human being. Those quotes
I'm
by
writing a
William.
whole thing on William Blake. He talks about that Jesus is the imagination. He makes an equivalency. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another guy who talked, a more contemporary guy. What's his name? Goddard, something like that.
Oh yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
there's
Neville Goddard. Yeah, yeah.
yes, Neville Goddard says the same thing, and
Right.
so
Exactly.
when we say the imagination is the human being, everything which is the creative part, which is what I totally agree. I think the golden age of humanity will be when everyone's acknowledged their creative participation in not reacting to the dream, but creating the dream. I think that's our
Yeah, yeah,
destiny.
yeah. And to be creating the dream, the matrix underlying that is the creative imagination. We are creatively imagining. We
Mm-hmm.
are creating our experience, is another way
Mm-hmm.
of saying it, each and every moment. By the way we interpret the ink blot, by the way we interpret what's happening to us, by this meaning we place on the ink blot. And there's no one else doing that. There's no one else creating our experience for us. We are the meaning generators. And but the source of that is the creative imagination.
Right. I love that you mentioned Henri Corbin in your book, because he's someone
Oh,
that when I've been teaching remote viewing, which is a way to tap into the imaginal realm, and he defined it. He says this is not imaginary. This is an actual realm of existence that's not physical or
yeah,
intellectual. And that really made me understand, well, that's what we're doing when we're
yeah,
using
yeah.
our greater mind. What were we going to say about Henri Corbin,
Yeah.
though?
Well, no, I'm a huge fan of Corbin, and in the book there's a big chapter, "The Battle for Our Angel," where I really unfold his work.
Mm.
And his idea of there's the imaginal realm, that is exactly what Jung talks about, the reality of the psyche. And what Jung says, he goes, this is the greatest discovery of the entire 20th century in the realm of
Yes.
psychology. Is the reality of psyche, that the psyche, even though it's immaterial, it can't be quantified, you can't measure it, but it's ontologically as real and even fundamentally more real than this physical universe. And it's the realm where of dreaming, of shamans, of people having
Yeah.
visions. That's in the imaginal realm, which they make the point. Yeah, like Corbin says, it's not imaginary, which connotes that, oh, it's like doesn't exist.
Fantasy. Yeah.
No, it has a huge effect on our experience.
Mhm.
And yeah, and it's funny because I'm actually in the middle of a huge piece I'm writing on exactly the imaginal realm and the reality of the psyche.
The imaginal mundus. And where does Jung mention that in his writings? Because I'm also looking into that.
Well, what's that for the reality of the psyche?
Yeah, yeah. Is that what you're talking about? Where he says it's the most important thing that
Yeah,
we
yeah,
could
yeah.
discover?
And
Oh,
and it's all throughout his work, but
mhm.
one of the major things is, like, it came out in 2009, his Red Book. And
Mhm.
the Red Book, where he was having these imaginal dialogues with these, and just to trip out on what he was experiencing, for example, there was a figure in his psyche, he named it Philemon, who was obviously part of Jung, but was self-created and seemingly autonomous and independent of Jung, and was teaching Jung, stuff that Jung himself didn't know. And it
Mhm.
blew Jung's mind. And this was an example of the reality of the psyche. And Philemon, actually, this imaginal figure, taught Jung For example, oh, you think you create your thoughts? Well, that's like if there's animals in the forest or birds in the air or people around, you think you create them? You think you're creating a dream?
Well,
No,
but you say they are part of our dream, though. In the way
they
you,
are on one level. You see, that's the trippiness. On one level, Philemon was a part of Jung, but on another level, he manifested as an independent, self-created, autonomous being who was teaching stuff to Jung that Jung didn't know. But what he was basically, one of the main things that Philemon taught Jung is, you think you create your thoughts. You're mistaken. Thoughts create themselves, you know.
mm,
And so many of us, when we hear that, we're like, what? But when you go into, your mind very deeply, you discover the profundity of what Philemon was teaching Jung. But imagine Jung's predicament. Here he's trying to be a scientist and have credibility, and then like the whole basis of entire life's work was taught to him by an imaginal being. How is he going to share that in a way that's going to, not
well,
just destroy his credibility?
well, even right now, the Institute of Noetic Science is studying channeling as a phenomenon. It sounds like that. But getting back to Jung, talked about this imaginative realm. He told that the imaginative cognition is which a remote viewing is. There's a cognition we can, and when people remote view, means their consciousness is not local. In my class, 10 out of 10 people got a target that they had no idea of knowing. And it's
Right.
like, how are they doing that? Because we've tapped in
It's
to
because
the,
the psyche is non-local. It transcends third dimensional space and time. And the thing about the remote viewing, you
yeah.
know, because I'm very, very familiar with that. I mean, I won't go into, the depth of that, but the sense of, we all have these incredible capabilities, whether telepathy, being able to remote view, just being psychic, but we've been conditioned and programmed out of them, and we've disassociated from those very natural abilities.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. One other thing I want to get to in your book is the Wilhelm Reich work, that because he was so far ahead of his time, and you talk particularly about his book, The Murder of Christ. Now, talk what is important about that book that Reich talks about.
Yeah. So he, like I point out in my work, so many people, are tracking Wetiko, not only spiritual traditions, every spiritual tradition, but visionary creative artists like Wilhelm Reich, like Philip K. Dick,
Mm-hmm.
Wilson, Colin Wilson. But the Wilhelm Reich, he talks about the emotional plague, and he talks about the murder of Christ, and the way he describes it, he's completely pointing out Wetiko, that we ourselves, we're unwittingly colluding in killing the Christ within, but we don't know we're doing that. And so he's really unfolding, the Christ story and seeing it through symbolic eyes, and having the recognition that, I mean, what he's in essence saying is that Christ, out of his infinite love for humanity, he allowed himself to like play out the very inner process that all of us are doing, in which we're killing our own light and murdering our own light. And by him actually, kind of embodying that and manifesting that through the Christ event and the crucifixion, he's actually, and a lot of people weren't even conscious of what he was showing us. But more and more, what Reich is saying is, more and more, that unconscious process where we're colluding in our own victimization, that more and more of us are becoming conscious, thankfully, in part to Reich's work. And he actually says that, yeah, the murder of Christ, the end of it is at hand, as more and more of us wake up and see. Because think about it, when Christ was crucified, who killed him? We did, humanity. That's a reflection of what we're acting out within our own minds. And when you realize that, all of a sudden, all of that unconscious energy that's getting funneled into self-hatred and self-destruction and acting out our addictions becomes freed for creative expression with love and compassion. It's the same energy, but instead of just, we're just slowly committing suicide and killing ourselves, all of a sudden that energy can become accessed for something positive.
It's so strange though that in a way Reich himself was crucified, and
Oh, well, his books were burned, and I think he died in prison. I mean, it was, and he
yeah.
was an incredible, he was so ahead of his time, such an amazing bodhisattva, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah, so let's move into the revelation. And you're saying, yes, if we're all creative in that way, and there's a dialogue of Plato where he's talking about Socrates meeting a poet, and he says to the poet, do you know what makes your work so great? And the poet says, yes, it's when I'm emphasizing this and then. He goes, Socrates, no. He says, what makes your work so great is when you're out of the way and the gods are speaking
Right,
through you.
right,
And that's where we have to come through, moving into how the divine is
right.
going. And how do we do that though, Paul? Help us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, well, I mean, I totally relate to that because, like when I write my books and I write in the morning, as I'm like waking up and brushing my teeth, I'm getting downloads about what I'm going to write about. And I've learned to distinguish it's a different energetic signature between when I'm just in sort of like the monkey mind, the neurotic mind that I need to ignore. There's a different energy when I'm getting a download. And then I'm just an employee and I really pay attention and, I'm getting the dictate from the boss. And then when I write, to the extent I'm able, I just get out of my own way and whatever's coming through comes through. And then afterwards, when I'll read it, I'll be like, wow, that's really good. Who wrote that? So I'm very aware of what you're saying. And that's why for me, and I think for everyone who's involved in this way, creative expression is like oxygen for the soul. And, so it just involves, and we all have so many people I know are like, oh, I have resistance to being creative. I feel stuck. Oh, I'm not creative at all. And, that's a huge thing about, and I would be interested, I try to slow down their experience and tell me what happens in that moment when you feel that resistance. What do you do? Do you go belly up? Do you indulge in it? Do you identify with it? Do you split off? Or are you able to be present with it in a way where it becomes the portal? Because the greater the potential breakthrough that we're going to have in our creative work, the greater the resistance. In the same way that the more we get closer to our light, the more the demons get attracted. And instead of that being an error, no, that's a sign that we're on, I've learned this from myself. When I feel the most, negative energy attacking me, I'm ecstatic. I'm like, great, I'm on the right path. Instead of at first, I would be like, wow, I'm really screwed up. And why do I have such a big problem? And so I think this is important,
Yeah.
just
But is there any way to shift that, because maybe the closer we get, the more, I mean, why does it have to be so hard that way? I mean, why can't
yeah.
we just, I mean,
Yeah,
is that
I mean, if I could write a book about that, I'd be a billionaire type of thing. That is like the question, but it brings up for me, the idea in his work. Jung talks about holding the tension of the opposites, holding the creative tension. And this has to do with we're all like Christ on the cross. That's an outpicturing. That's a reflection of what all of us are going through. And think about what the cross, what it symbolizes. It's a perfect symbol of holding that tension of the opposites. And the thing we don't want to do, because it's very painful, is to prematurely identify with one of the opposites and to marginalize the other. That creates disease, right?
Mm.
But if we're able to like really to carry our cross and to bear that incredible creative tension, Jung says, and I'm not just quoting him as a scholar, but I experience this every day. When we're able to hold that creative tension and the pain of it with integrity, out of that comes the transcendent function, whose function is transcendence, is helping us to step out of ourselves.
Right? You talk about solving the puzzle at the end of the book, this symbols, and you said are the language of dreams, and they're also everything around us is a symbol of our psyche. So me talking to you symbolically is reflecting to me an aspect where someone's really onto understanding the nature of the mind and the struggles that we're in. You're symbolizing that to me. And then how do we then work with the symbols that are being presented to us to wake ourselves up? I mean, what's
Yeah, yeah,
your
yeah. And that's like that's such a great question, because it makes me think one of the translations in Buddhism of enlightenment is Mahamudra, which actually means the great symbol. It also means the great attitude. So what makes something a symbol or not is a function of our attitude. And a symbol is different than a sign. A sign can really be understood. It's literal, like one way, do not enter. That's a sign. But a symbol is an emanation of something deeper, and it's actually a portal to the very deeper place that it's an emanation of. And
Goethe has a great saying about what the symbol is: a instant revelation of the unutterable, but it's there. I compare it. Let's say there's a stop sign as a sign. It's a sign, but you put that stop sign in an ocean of polluted water, it becomes a symbol. But anyway, that's just my way.
Right. I love that. That's a great example. No, totally. Yeah. And so, in other words, what makes, our experience moment by moment symbolic, and therefore connecting with the revelation and universe being an oracle, is nothing other than our attitude. Is nothing other than what we do with it. There's no objective anything. That's what quantum physics has shown, and so that's why, for me, like all day, every day, these are the conversations I have with everyone. And I'm just not interested. It's not interesting to me at all to have like mundane, boring conversations where people are just, absorbed in the superficial dimension of things, And what I notice is that all of the people that I interact with in this way and converse with in this way, we psychoactivate each other. We activate each other's psyche and activate our dreaming even more, like we've taken a psychedelic, but without any drug.
Right. So we wouldn't like hang out and talk about sports because people.
No, that's the one thing. I'm a big sports fan.
Oh, you are.
People joke it's my shadow side, but no, that's it's funny you bring that up, Ellen. Yeah.
Because that's the most mundane thing. It's the same ball game every day. I mean, whatever. But yeah,
right. No,
it
totally.
Symbolizes something for you, though, which means something for you. It's meaningful for you, though.
Yeah, no, totally. And one thing it symbolizes for me, because I can, the work I'm doing is pretty intense, and and all that. So it's the way I just sort of step out of all the seriousness and just let myself be an adolescent, and I love it. It feels really healthy,
But let's say we want to really build a new world of consciousness. I mean, would we want to educate children saying, you're dreaming, everyone in your class here, and people are acting out there? I mean, how do we start to, you're doing it one person at a time, which is great, and you really are hopeful in this book, in the Undreaming Wetiko, that it's possible to live in a world where we're not plagued by Wetiko. So what do you envision as the formula for that?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because just to invoke quantum physics for a second, quantum physics is trying to understand what are the building blocks of the physical world, what is the microstructure of our experience. And as they went down in scale, they more and more didn't find anything physical, but they found consciousness. And the way they would articulate it is that there are these quantum entities that exist in a state of potentiality. Every and any state they could ever manifest, they're in that potential state until the moment of observation. And then one of those states actualizes, right? And that's happening each and every moment. But the point is, and this isn't me, these are the founding fathers of quantum physics, they're saying that even if one of those potentialities, and this is pretty much a quote, is ridiculously and highly unlikely, it could still be what manifests this very moment. So to do a commentary on that, the fact that our species could actually wake up and avert all the myriad catastrophes that we are creating, that are converging on us, quantum physics says, oh, that's absolutely positively within the realm of possibility. And if you're not envisioning that, then what in the world are you thinking? If you're just, I'm consumed with pessimism and despair, and if you see the world in that way, being a dream, you're going to attract all the evidence confirming your viewpoint, and then you're part of the problem, because that'll make your viewpoint even more fixed.
Well, my hope, I wrote this book. I should send you a copy of my book on UFOs, Making Contact.
I would love that. Yeah, I'll send you my address. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, do that, because, for me, that is an outlet into an unknown reality that is infiltrating into this very closed system of the world, and now even Congress. And there was just this UAP amendment that was put out by Chuck Schumer, and there's people inside are whistleblowing, and people's realities are being blown open. It's like their dream is not contained in the old ways. And for me, if nothing else, who cares about aliens? It's I mean, yes, there's probably something out there, but it's expanding possibilities. What were you going to
Yeah,
say?
well, just to make sure both Terence McKenna and Young were of the same opinion about the alien phenomena, the ET phenomena, and they saw it symbolically, that we are so split off from our true nature that the only way we can begin to first experience it, we project it out, it gets dreamed up, and we then experience this part of us in alien form because we're so alienated from it in our own minds, and I just love that, because that's an example of seeing things symbolically. Yeah, what does this UFO or these ETs symbolize?
Except McKenna had a real vivid experience of a UFO, that flying overhead in the jungles of South America. He saw this thing.
No, sure, but that doesn't preclude what I was saying too about McKenna. And it's so funny. I remember a number of years ago, I was having dinner with two of my lamas, and some friends of mine were there. And all of a sudden, one asked the lamas, and these are two of the greatest lamas of Tibet, "What do you think about ETs?" And they were like, "Oh, well, they're here right now." I'll never forget that. So from their point of view, yeah, they're not like out there. They're like, in this moment available.
Right. Well, Jung also says, yeah, that's all part of this symbolic imagination. That's the mystery talking to us. And he says, if you read that book, there are people who have actual experiences, and he was concerned about that. I mean, yes, it's symbolic, it's all symbolic. And those are two parts of the same. I mean, you're symbolic of my reality. I'm talking to myself here, and you're there as a real human being. I think.
Right. No, totally. I mean, I'm sure you know the work. He was a friend of mine, John Mack from Harvard.
Oh, John Mack. Yeah, I loved.
He
wrote a chapter. You actually wrote a chapter. I mean, I found an old unpublished essay that John Mack wrote, and I asked his archivist if I can include it in this book, and he said, of course. So yes, John Mack.
Because one time he was visiting me out in Portland, and he came to one of my groups, right? And it was the most amazing thing, because after the group ended, we were all socializing and all that. And he was talking to a friend of mine who had been an experiencer, who had been abducted, right? And she was a super amazing person. And I happened to walk by them, and the snippet of conversation I heard, she said, "Oh yeah, and then I got off the spaceship, and I got this nosebleed, the worst nosebleed I'd ever had in my life." And he goes, "Well, of course, that's what always happens." And I was just like, what? So yeah, it's a weird sort of like dimension where, is that just the psychic dimension? Did that physically happen? Were the mind and matter interfacing in a way that we're just not familiar with? It's very, very interesting.
It's interesting also what I'm seeing, and based on what you're saying, the world is about to take a quantum leap by the acknowledgement of this other element in there, and it's happening on a very official way. The governments, it's sort of like the church saying the world, of course, is the center of the universe, and Copernicus and Galileo saying no, and that changes the perspective. We're in this change of how we look at ourselves in relationship.
I would say one thing about what you just said. You were saying the world, it's about to make a quantum leap. I would say it already has, or it is in this very moment.
Yeah, it is. And people are uncomfortable about that. That's why your work is so important, because people are uncomfortable in looking at themselves and their limited view. And you're saying there's more.
Well, here's one of the things that I think is really important. It's an example of the profundity of what I'm pointing out about Wetiko. So just if we can imagine being in a night dream, right? And if you're in a night dream, what is a dream? But it's a reflection of your mind, each and every moment, whatever's going on inside of your psyche is informing and giving shape to the dream. And so say I'm holding a viewpoint, for example, I'm in a night dream and I'm holding a viewpoint that the night dream is real and objective and separate from me. Then the night dream, which is just it's nothing other than a reflection of my mind, will absolutely reflect back and give me all the evidence I need to confirm the truth of my viewpoint, i.e., that the dream is objective, separate from my mind. So now I have all the confirmation I need, which makes me even more fixed in my viewpoint that the world is objective. And the more I see the world as objective in the dream, the more the world will reflect that back, give me all the evidence, ad infinitum, in a self-perpetuating feedback loop in which I've hypnotized myself by my own creative genius. The source of that process is in our own mind. What my work in Wetiko is about is trying to like shed light on that illusion that we are actually generating ourselves, and then we're getting conditioned by it in a way that's taking away our freedom, and it's disconnecting us from our creative genius. That, in essence, is what I'm trying to get across.
No, I think it's great. It's so hard to pin down in ourselves. But what's the best way? Because Joe Dispenza and all these people saying you can create the ultimate reality you want to live in. What to you, if we want to create the best dream, which is the most joyful experience, the most creative, participation in the world? How do we do that with the way you're, thinking and working?
Yeah. Well, what comes up, I could write a book about that,
Yeah.
but the idea, like one of the simple ways of thinking about Wetiko, remember it's malignant egophrenia, me disease. It's a misidentification with who we think we are. Because let me just take a step back. You see, Wetiko is expressed in all the spiritual wisdom traditions. It's in the apocryphal text. It got edited out of the canon of the regular Bible because Wetiko was on the editorial board because it can't stand to be seen. But it actually, in the apocryphal text, they call it the counterfeiting spirit. Okay. So Wetiko has no creativity at all, but it's a master mime. It impersonates us. It puts us on. Okay. And what I mean, it'll offer us a fake version of ourselves. Oh, I'm limited, I'm traumatized, I'm wounded. And if we then identify, if we're not awake in that moment, if we identify with its artificial version of ourselves, then it has us, then it can control us. And if you think about what I'm describing, here, Wetiko, it actually can't steal our soul, but it tricks us into giving ourself away. And then we identify with who we're not, with its false version, and we forget who we are. And then we disconnect from our creative agency. That's a recipe for madness. That's Wetiko in a nutshell. What I'm pointing out is that when any one of us sees that, and of course you need to continually stabilize and deepen it, because it's so easy to get absorbed back into the forms of the waking dream. But when you stabilize that and you embody that in your life and you connect with other people who are also, switched on to that, and you help each other to, deepen your realization. What I'm pointing out, this is the mystical body of Christ. This is the real Sangha in Buddhism. When you do that, so it all has to do with stepping out of the separate self and recognizing that we're interconnected, we're parts of each other, we depend on each other for our own survival. When you bring people together in that way, that's where all bets are off, because that's when we can realize, wait a second, this waking dream we're having is manifesting in such a dark, destructive, evil seeming way. It's manifesting that way because we've been conditioned and programmed to dream it that way. And now we're seeing through that so we can dream it differently. And this is to realize we can consciously step into our own evolutionary process. This is what this whole thing is about.
No, I love that. And that's so key. But when you say Wetiko has no creative energy at all, isn't its creativity, it's trickery, it's masking, it's pretend? Isn't that an act of creativity?
That's not like the true, when somebody just, when they, kind of are a copycat of what you're doing or
Yeah.
impersonating it, that's not creative.
Right.
And so what I'm pointing out is that, yeah, just like a vampire has no energy, doesn't have any life in and of itself. If there was no one outside of it, it wouldn't exist. It needs to plug into another person's life force in order to give itself a quasi life. In the same way, Wetiko has no creativity. So to the extent we're unconscious of our own creativity, it plugs into us. and then it turns our creativity against ourselves. And if I could just say one thing, because this is important, if somebody came into my office with a dream that they had just last night, and the dream was, oh, I'm living on planet Earth, and there are fascist forces creeping all over the planet, and they're taking away our liberties, and they're locking us down, and in other words, they're having a dream of exactly what's happening in our world, and they would ask me, how would you interpret that dream? Well, I would point out to them, well, clearly you're not in touch with your intrinsic creative power. You've outsourced it. And external powers like the state are more than happy to assume your own power and turn it against you. And the point is that we need to connect with our nature, with our creative nature. That's the key.
I think you're right. Creativity, my teacher, I had a spiritual teacher, he says we're here to make known the unknown. And the unknown is everything that is yet to be created. That's really the purpose of incarnation. And I take that as being active creators by we emulate creation as creators, which means in my opening introduction, I talk about poesis. You know that word poesis, where poetry comes from. It's about making things that have yet to exist. So we have to drop into this poesis way of being in the world.
Well, that's alchemically, they talk about, it's a very important stage, coagulation. In other words, they say it's one thing if you have a vision or a dream, but you need to coagulate it to make it into earth, to make it into something, Right. And then there's another thing, and I forget which book I talk about this. There's this Russian philosopher, Nicholas Berdyaev, who talks about, he's very into theology and God.
I think we talk about it in this book, actually, in the latest.
Okay. Right. When you write so many books, I forget which is where, type of thing. Right. And no thanks. And he's talking about the second coming. And he says, if we're just passively waiting for the second coming, then it'll never happen. And we'll just continually see the crucified face of Christ. But when any of us activate and step into our own creative nature, then by doing that, we are actually participating in incarnating the second coming through our act of being creative.
I call that actually the flowering of humanity, when all of us are allowed to be the creative manifestation of this connection to the divine and bring through new, songs.
Yeah, that thing, it brings up like how it's like a dangerous situation in our world right now to express ourselves. To like, oh, I feel like I feel this empathy for the Palestinians. Oh, you can get totally deplatformed or censored or whatever. And when there's censorship, you see the thing which is interesting, like there is in the world today, that's an expression of Wetiko. But what happens when there's censorship, or when we're kids and we weren't allowed to shine our light and to express ourselves, that becomes internalized. And then it gets pushed out into the unconscious. And then we start doing it to ourselves. We shut ourselves down preemptively without even knowing we're doing it. And then, of course, we develop symptoms and we become neurotic. And so this external process of being censored, and that's just like abuse. There could be the historical moment of abuse. The abuser then exits stage left. But what makes abuse is when we internalize it and then we start doing it to ourselves.
Well, that's such an important point in your book, is where you talk about parents and child abuse, and how child abuse is just it's the unresolved trauma of the parent becomes in a way the unconscious motivation of the child. If and that's
and it gets passed down.
It's passed down. So is there ever a way to really end that? Because we're all acting out our childhood wounds and traumas.
Yeah. Well, interesting. I just want to connect this. Jung says that evil gets regenerated over the generations, which is really interesting, because that maps onto if our parents, they've been abused by their parents. And if our parents don't deal with it and integrate that, they're going to unconsciously be compelled to just pass on, like the psychic inheritance of the unhealed abuse to the offspring, to us. And so it's like this multi-generational ancestral lineage that is continually perpetuating itself up until any one of us actually does our inner work. And it can feel really unfair because, it was my father who did this or whatever. But another point of view is that what an honor that you're in the role of breaking the chain. And so if any one of us is able to really do our work and to unlock and to step out of just compulsively, unconsciously enacting the abuse, then, and I don't understand this, but I feel it's totally true, that actually goes back in time through all the ancestors and even through the future people who haven't even been born yet, and heals that energetic abuse in the whole lineage.
Well, that's are you talking about family constellation work? Have you
Well,
done
I'm
that?
familiar with it, but I'm not talking about family constellation. I'm talking about my own, this is from my own experience, and that's what I
That
write about.
is what happens in family constellation, because you're actually engaging in how I understand the field of your family, of your immediate family and the larger relative grandparents. And there's a field actually that you exist in, and you can correct the imbalance, and that
Right.
changes the past and the future. I mean, I knew a woman whose mother had a daughter, left her father, and then her grandmother did the same thing, and she ended up doing the same thing in her marriage. Like, and
Right.
it's like that is it's the patterns of Wetiko that maybe are also passed down, is what I'm seeing. There's Wetiko functions within families in particular ways, and it's just is that
Oh,
true?
completely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it informs the archetypal pattern, that it's like the blueprint for how we perceive and think and behave, and if it's unconscious, and if there's, split off shadowy parts, yeah, that's going to inform our behavior. And but what I'm pointing out is that encoded in that very acting out, in that process, because for example, when I'll say, oh, Wetiko, it's like this revelation, one of the things that it's revealing to us is the profound primary importance of the human psyche in creating our personal experience and actually creating world events. Because Wetiko, it's a dreamed up phenomena. We are co-dreaming our own unconscious shadow in the forms of the world, seemingly out there. And we just can easily experience, oh, I'm a passive victim, I'm not doing anything. But when you recognize the dreamlike nature, you realize, no, we're all co-dreaming up this madness and this evil. And to see that is to connect you, with your nature and with your creative power. And in essence, what I'm really talking about is that when enough people have that realization, just like Wetiko is a dreamed up phenomena that we're dreaming up, we can undream it. That's the point, and that's within our power. We already have that power. It's not like we have to first get it. No, we already possess it. We are that power, but we don't recognize it. In essence, that's what my work is about, is trying to like empower people in that way and continually, hopefully, empower myself too, because I'm a work in progress like all of us.
Aren't we living in exciting times that I mean, it feels really exciting what you're doing, because you have to be so present, especially when you're doing the groups and writing your books, to be aware of the pulse of this thing. Like you can't slip into unconscious. You have to look the present and the future in the face as it's coming to you. So
it's really funny what that brings up for me. When I wrote my first book on Wetiko, which came out over 10 years ago, and interestingly, it's selling, the sales are increasing, more and more, because I think I was a little bit ahead of my time.
Yeah.
And the world, if I had a publicity department, they couldn't create a better marketing campaign than what's happening in the world.
Right.
It's like showing what I'm talking about. But people have said to me, "Oh, you were prescient when you wrote your first book. How did you know that?" Because now everything that's played out is confirming the very thing I was trying to point out. And I was saying, no, I wasn't telling the future at all. I was just like really clearly seeing the deeper process that had informed our past and that was giving shape to our present. And I was just trying to like shed light on that, because the typical artist is like the canary in the coal mine. They're actually seeing what's happening in the collective unconscious that, the non-creative person is not, and that's where I keep on saying it's the artists that are going to be the healers of the world. That's why the shaman is the creative artist.
Right. I agree. There's that famous quote by Marshall McLuhan who says the artist is like the DEW, the Distance Early Warning System for the collective consciousness. You know McLuhan's work?
Yeah, I know McLuhan. I just didn't know that quote. That's great.
Yeah, that's a great quote about the artist. He's looking out the front windshield. Everyone's looking out the back windshield. So one last question in a way, and maybe there's no answer, is Wetiko and individuals, everyone have their own Wetiko, or is Wetiko the collective awareness of this big thing that infiltrates into everyone?
Just to associate it, your question, it brings to mind like when Christ, when people had visions of Christ, some people saw him as an old man, other people saw him as a young boy. And the idea is that, he would manifest to each person tailor-made to their process, tailor-made to their unconscious. So here, Wetiko, it's this archetypal energy, a universal impersonal energy, and yet it's tailor suited to each one of us. So it'll manifest in my psyche, in my life, in a different way than it does in yours. And it depends on my abuse or how awake I am or how asleep I am, or, all those factors. And just like a symbol in a dream, you're going to have a dream tonight and you'll have a symbol, and that symbol will be different than the symbol that I'm having, because your symbol is tailor suited to like just exactly where Alan is at. It's going to be like, oh, I'm going to forge a symbol in this way. And then, but for Paul, who's at a different level, oh, it'll be different. So it really depends on the person's process.
Right. It's sort of like almost equates to synchronicities, right? There's synchronicities all the time happening when you notice it. It might just be for you, or like, you're reading a word, you're hearing it on the radio. It's like, boom, what's the dream really trying to tell me about that moment? And
right.
It's just the world unfolding as it is.
Yeah, and I point out, I think in the new book, I have a big chapter on synchronicity, and I point out that when we cultivate the awareness, synchronistic awareness, that is to dispel Wetiko, because all of a sudden you're seeing that there's this unified field underlying and informing and containing all of the seeming physical manifestations of our world. And instead of just getting sort of hypnotized by the forms of the waking dream, no, you're seeing the non-local field that's like coming through all of it. And that's when you begin to realize the universe is an epiphany, it's a theophany, it's a revelation, it's an oracle. And when you realize that, you've expanded your consciousness. You see, because the thing about Wetiko, the greatest protection against Wetiko is to cultivate, compassion, which is our nature, but also to connect with our true nature. When we actually remember who we are and we're stabilized in that, Wetiko has no currency over us. It's only when, if you remember, I said, it's the counterfeiting spirit. It'll offer you a false version of yourself. And if you're not awake in that moment, you will then identify with its fictitious version. And then spend the rest of your life defending and protecting that artificial identity. And that's just tragic, because that energy could be funneled towards being creative and being loving.
So the counterfeiting spirit, like going back to your group, something comes up in a group and I'm triggered. That's the counterfeiting spirit making it out there as an issue.
Well, the being triggered is not necessarily any problem at all.
Oh.
That's part of the dream. That's not Wetiko. It's what we do when we're being triggered.
How we react to the trigger. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I could just say one thing about the trigger, because it's important and it's helpful. In Buddhism, they have this phrase like, hold the gaze of the lion, the lion's gaze. And here's what they mean. They say, when you throw a stick with a dog, the dog runs after the stick. And think about, that as like, oh, when I get triggered, if I indulge in my trigger and I think the problem's out there and the person triggering me, that's being like the dog. But when you throw a stick with the lion runs after you. And they say, hold the gaze of the lion. When you get triggered, instead of just indulging and putting your attention outside of yourself, immediately self-reflect and see what inside of you has been touched, because there's an incredible opportunity to add consciousness to an unconscious part. That's the lion's gaze. And it's a real major practice in Buddhism. And that's one of the practices we do in the groups.
That's great, Paul. That's a good kind of note to end on, in a sense. So, hold the gaze of the lion, because that's the challenge of being the creative self in the world, coming through and living.
Right. And there's a real responsibility, because then there's no one to blame,
Right. Don't we want to blame our parents and all that? Because that's the Wetiko wanting to.
I've had to go through that, because my father, actually, what he played out, it on one hand, it was just like offering itself to be blamed. because it was so dark. But
Right.
then at a certain point, if I could stay my whole life blaming him, and that would just be tragic. So I've been fortunate in that what played out and the unbelievable like trauma and the encounter with evil through my father, I've been able to alchemically transmute it, and it's helped me to write my books. So I've turned it into medicine.
Your father is giving you the gift that you've given to the world. I mean, really, without that trauma from your father,
Yeah.
no one would know the depth of what you're discovering, which
Yeah. No, and that's the opportunity for all of us to turn our wounding and our abuse and our trauma to alchemically transmute it. It's the archetypal idea of finding the light that's hidden, encoded in the darkness. That's another thing that I continually just write about, and that's, real alchemy.
it's the hero's journey too. The hero is sucked into the underworld and
Right.
must find that thing inside themselves that
Right.
they could reform, and they give that gift, that boon, back to the world once they return to the
Yeah, and it's very
surface.
much related to the wounded healer, or
Yeah.
the wounded healer is like, instead of the wound being something bad that they need to get rid of, no, it becomes a portal, just like the shaman, descends into the underworld. And like I'm saying, that's the deeper archetype that's happening in our world. We're all making a descent into the darkness of the unconscious, and it's dangerous because we can get stuck there. But the idea is to find that light, is to typically in the myth, the shaman comes back to the world with gifts that they've
Yeah.
received via their ordeal. And that's exactly, all of
That's what,
us.
and you particularly are an incredible example of that, just your life work. And so what excites you most now? I mean, what are you really excited about working on these days?
Oh, well, just a little while ago, I haven't, my quantum physics book is coming out next year in a revised, expanded form, but I've just plugged in and getting downloads of my new book. And it's just a more deepening inquiry into Wetiko, into the reality of the psyche, Corbin's imaginal realm, into the dream, into quantum physics, into the importance of being creative. And I'm just articulating the very thing I've been describing for all my books, but in a completely new way. So
Wow.
that's what turns me on right now.
Well, I am always excited talking to original thinkers, people who take what everyone sees, the awfulness of the world, turning it around, and making a brilliant light out of that. Thank you, because it's you're not objective. You're in it. You're in the world, doing battle with Wetiko, in a
Yeah, and I
sense.
just want to say, I mean, I appreciate that, and it's the way I'm keeping myself sane. And just one final thought form to trip out. My family, because my parents died over 20 years ago, and the rest of my relatives, they've kind of excommunicated me. They think, oh, Paul's just crazy. He's mentally ill. He's out of his mind. And, I don't know what to do with that. I just have to, okay, whatever.
Right.
And, that was part of like the tragedy of what played out with my father. And I've just had to live with that. Yeah.
But according to with your advice, if they're thinking you're crazy, they're not looking at their own craziness
Yeah,
about that. And
totally.
that's not in a way your problem, because you're
Yeah.
cleaning, like the Buddhists say, you're cleaning the cup every day.
Yeah, and I've created this incredible soul family. I have,
Yeah.
friends all over the world, and whatever. So I'm all good in that way. It's just, I'm glad that I remembered to share. That's like a little bit of the tragedy of what played out for me.
Right.
But I'm okay.
But it's the wound that just keeps reminding you of the wound. I mean, maybe it's, I don't know, helping you in a way.
Yeah, oh, it
Remember.
is. I mean, because it's one of the key things in our healing with whatever wound or pain we're going through. It's so easy to pathologize ourselves or personalize it. But then when you recognize, oh, this very pain that I'm feeling, this is as a microcosm, I'm just reflecting the very malady and wound and pain that's in everyone and that's in the collective. And when you see that, all of a sudden you're stepping out of the separate self, because you're recognizing, oh, wow, we're all reflecting each other. We're all parts of one another. And then you've stepped out of the separate self. And that is, in a way, the healing.
But it also helps you recognize the wound in others. You're feeling your wound. You can actually heal
Well,
other
no, I'm
people.
really glad you mentioned that because I'm so familiar and fluent and intimate with my own wound. You
Mm,
know, when I work with people and everybody, we're all dealing with our woundedness. I see instead of, unconsciously wanting to fix them or give them advice, because that's so often, oh, if they feel better, then I won't have to, have the reminder of my own wound. But no, because I'm so able to be present with my own wound, which I've cultivated for over 40 years,
mm,
24/7, when I meet somebody in their wound, I'm very comfortable in just being present with them. And that is like, I think 50% of the healing when a person feels really met and seen
mm.
in that way.
And then you help them be actually comfortable with that wound as well. So, that's the transference. It's like what the lamas do. There's a transfer, an initiation, a transmission in a sense
Yeah. Well, in the
from,
same way, when I got out of the last mental hospital in 82, because there were like, 4 or 5 times in that year and a half where I just had my awakening and I was a free agent and I was freaking people out so much that I continually got pathologized and
mm,
hospitalized. And I remember then I met these great lamas and I would go to them and I realized, wait a second, they're actually in relationship to the part of me that's whole and healed and awakened because
mm,
everybody else was like, you're mentally ill and and all that. And by them doing that, it was creating a bridge in myself for me to like step into the part of me that was whole and healed and awakened. And then when I reflected on it, I realized they could only do that because they're so in touch with their own,
mm,
wholeness. And
mm,
then I realized over the years, I'm like, wow, just in a natural way, that's I think more and more what I do with people is they can come in with I call it the Halloween costume. Oh, I'm so traumatized, I'm so screwed
mm,
up. And more I realize, no, I don't get hooked by that. I see the part of them that's whole and awake and already healed.
mm.
And then I realized, my God, I'm doing for them what my lamas did for me.
Mhm. That's great. And you're doing it for everyone listening to you and reading your books, and we're understanding deeper parts of ourselves. I think, Undreaming Wetiko is a big key for helping the planet. I mean, one by one. So
Thank
I'd
you.
love to do more conversations.
Yeah, would love to. Absolutely. This has
And
been so
maybe.
fun, Alan. I just love the spontaneity of it. We had no script other than just hang out.
Yeah, and I'm really interested because you really, you say things, it's like, oh yeah, I can feel it in myself, and then it slips away, and then it's like, oh, there it is again. It's like the Wetiko energies, and it starts to become more, I'm aware of it more as we talk about it more, and how I could, with self-awareness, not go to those old places, but become more conscious. It's about waking up in
Yeah,
whatever
yeah. And
way.
that final thing that's why like hanging out with other people who are also switched on, it can really help all of us to stabilize our realization.
Yeah. Thanks. What's your website for people to go and find you and
Okay,
all
if
that?
people are interested, if they want to awaken in the
Mhm.
dream, go to awakeninthedream.com. You know,
Great. All right. Blessings on your process of awakening, and have a great holiday, which is,
Alan, thank you so much. It's just been super fun hanging out.
yeah, we'll do it again. And maybe I'll put you on a panel where we can like talk about it with other people
Sure. No,
dealing
I'd be happy.
in various ways, the same situation. Thanks, Paul. I know you got to go, but
Oh,
I
okay, take care.
appreciate
Okay,
you.
great.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Down Steinfeld. Thanks for watching today, and subscribe and send us a super